And welcome back to Devlog. You've caught me in the middle of moving my priceless collection of fine chinas. I sure hope I don't trip over this precariously placed clown horn. Oh no! Oh no, the plates have fallen into my collection of fireworks. Oh no, not my giant pile of balloons! And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part I worked on... and in this part I work on floor information logics to be able to have bouncing floors, sticky floors, slippery floors, and floors that move you like a conveyor belt. The first setup is how the system actually works. Very simply, I make a script for floor information, and then in the script I have a bunch of different information that the floor information can have, such as velocity, velocity dampening, if it bounces, if it's slippy, etc, etc. And then, since the player already has the setup for reading floor informations from a previous devlog where I set up the information about moving platforms, when the player reads where the platform is moving, it will also pick up this new script for floor information, which derives all the information for this devlog. Essentially, it's a big list of values that the player reads and then moves based on. The first of these values is if the floor is bouncy. What this does is it means that the player cannot actually stand on this floor. If they have landed on it, they could walk onto this floor, but providing they have landed on it, they will bounce straight off it. Think of this as like a funny jelly floor. You can sort of step onto it from one other platform, but if you land on it, it bounces off you. Gameplay-wise, no idea how this is going to work in a level, but I have the option. What I did for this is I made the entirety of a system for bouncing off objects, and then completely forgot that I had already made an entire system for bouncing off objects. I made the same system twice. I then realized that I had already made a system logic for bouncing off objects, so instead of using this new bouncing script that I have made for just specifically a bouncy floor object, I just derived information for how the player should bounce off based on the pre-existing bounce off logic for bouncing off objects. It's an older devlog, you'll have to find it, because I don't know how to add YouTube links in videos. I do actually. I just put a low amount of effort in making these videos and don't feel like adding one. So all I do now when landing on an object that we need to bounce off, as in a floor object, not a naturally bouncy object, I will detect if the player has landed on this object. If I do, I cancel out of the player being set on the ground. This is a different void script, don't worry about it. And I will instead bounce off this object. For actually bouncing off it, very easy, the bounce direction is set to the normals of the floor of whatever you landed on. So if the floor is at an angle, you would bounce off it at an angle and then have your velocity by whatever the angle of the floor you landed on was. And then have a certain amount of velocity, the player bounces off the floor, dictated by the scripting. This makes it so I can have funny bouncy floors, like a fun bouncy castle. Realistically, super easy, player has force based on the floor's normal direction, player bounce in that direction, player has some level of adjustment of control, so they can't just dictate their movements organically. Some of it is relied on the bounciness of the floor. Very simple system. Ideally, this was probably going to have a level designed around it where maybe a lot of the floors are candy covered, like a pink gummy candy that makes the player bounce off them. That's my current idea for this system. It's for level 6, which is about bouncing floors and candy projectiles, and has a heavy usage of enemies. Sure, let's go with that. That's the design for the floor bouncing. The next thing I added was floor velocity. Now, this may not make any sense. It's just a conveyor belt. It's just a conveyor belt. It's the logic for a conveyor belt. Now, you may think that this is complicated. It's not. When standing on a conveyor belt, we will check what the speed of the conveyor belt is. And when I say conveyor belt, this is just any platform that has a scripting attached to it. When we're standing on a conveyor belt, we will check what the velocity of the conveyor belt is. Anything above 0 is positive, anything below 0 is negative. Therefore, Positive is moving right, negative is moving left. This adds to our player's velocity amount, which you can see in the top left. And regardless of player movement, we just add this value to the player's current speed. So if the player is standing still, this value will have to be a specific amount for the player to continue to move, but if the player is moving on the platform, this will just add to the player's current movement speed. Of course, if the player is already moving at a high speed, then we're going to be exceeding our target speed, and this is also going to be ticking down normally, so the player isn't just having an egregious amount of speed added to their character if they're running at very high speeds. It's a conveyor belt. It's a conveyor belt in a 2D platformer. It's a conveyor belt in a 2D platformer. Super simple, baby! When on one of these velocity adding surfaces, I had to make a new movement animation for when the player is on one of these surfaces. Essentially, if the player is in an idle state, but they're still being moved by a surface, I want to convey this with the movement animation and make it look less stiff than them just standing completely still. So I have a wobble left and a wobble right animation, depending on the player's facing direction, with the velocity that is added to them. These will be blended into based on the player's velocity if they don't have any actual built-up speed, essentially if the player is standing still. I think they look very good. The player wobbles their arms around, they kick their legs a little bit. It has a very readable idea of the player being moved without their own control, and also looks very silly and goofy for the player, while also blending into the idle animation very easily, and if you start moving, blending into any running animations also very easily. These are nice animations. I like how they looked. They're basically just the same poses but mirrored in terms of the player's facing direction, so if they're being moved to the right, they will kind of wobble to the right, or if they're being moved to the left, relative to the player's facing direction, they will wobble to the left. There's not a really whole lot to explain with the motion, you kind of get the idea. The complicated aspect of this was trying to get the arms of the character to wiggle around in a circular clockwise or anti-clockwise direction based on the movements, which is kind of difficult when the player has 2D limbs, but I think I achieved it pretty well. What do you think? Leave a comment. Next we have sticky floors. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but there's sticky floors. Next we have sticky floors. This is by far the easiest system I have added to this game's floor information yet. Do you want to know how it works? If the player is stood on a sticky floor, they won't fall off it, even when defying gravity. Now you may be saying, how do you do that? Well, the game is designed so the player can run on any platform. I just disable the thing that makes the player fall off platforms if the platform's sticky. That's it. If floor information is sticky, ignore any logic that makes the player fall off the floor. Just to give a recap in case anyone hasn't seen the video of how I explain how to walk on walls, very simple. I just had the player's movement position based on the normal of a floor surface, and they rotate to the normal of the floor surface so they can easily walk or move on any walls. Since the game has its own physics system and doesn't rely on Unity's physics systems, I can just move the player based on this floor information logic. Think of it less as moving the player with velocity and more as moving the player along a track of whatever the hitbox we are currently stood on is, because that's pretty much how it works. So for sticky floors, I just ignore any gravity scripting or falling off scripting that I have set up in this system. The next system I have is slippery floors. This is the system where if the player hits a floor, they would lose all control and slide down the floor without any control until they fall off it or jump. Now you may be able to tell from my use of past tense and the fact that we haven't seen any floors like this that I removed this system, and I'll tell you why. It was an unfun system that was bad to play, bad to control, bad for level design, not very fun at all. Essentially, the way the system would have worked is there would just be platforms like one that had flowing water on it. Then when the player stood on these, they would lose all control of their player character and be forced down the movement of this system. I generally did not really like this idea for the game. I felt like having too many areas where the player loses all control of their movement is kind of counterintuitive to the game's overall design of having good fluid movement, and this system can be useful in some games, but I felt like for my game, it just made the movement not fun. So I made a compromise system that achieves the same similar result without having the player have this lack of control. All I added was a velocity dampening value. This, instead of the velocity adding value, is going to dampen the amount of speed the player can organically build themselves. So, for example, if stood on a floaty platform, maybe the dampening value is 6, and this way the player can only build a value of speed setup 6 by themselves, and the rest would be derived from the moving floating platform itself. So I can have a high value, so the player may have a harder time moving on a platform that has this slippery setup, while still applying a regular velocity value from the platform itself. So, for example, as the idea would have been, maybe one platform is a bunch of flowing water. This would have a velocity added value of whatever the velocity of the water is, but the player is trying to run up the flowing water. They will have a dampened velocity, meaning they can build speed a lot slower. Basically achieving the exact same result as a slippery surface, but having the player still be able to have a lot more control of their own gameplay and movements when on one of these slippery surfaces. That's it for Devlog. I feel like the floor information scripting is very useful for in-game, just by having variety to the plan of platforms that a player can land on. Unlike with other systems, I actually have ideas and plans for levels that could use this floor information scripting, so that's pretty poggers, that's pretty good. My favourite one, which I didn't mention in the video, is the conveyor belt scripting, mostly because I think it's visually very interesting. I really like the sprite setup and the animation I have made. For the conveyor belt animation, I think it's very stylish. It is a three-dimensional model, animated and rendered out, but I feel like it looks substantially 2D enough to fit with the art style of the game. In the next part, I'll be adding... I need to cut this episode short, for a hot babe has messaged me online!